Welcome back. Join me in the flight deck for service with Southwest Airlines from Sacramento to Ontario, California as we learn to fly the Boeing 737 MAX 8. Today's filed route and details are on the right if you'd like to follow along. Our APU is running, nav light and beacon is on, and we're ready to begin our pushback to get underway. With the ground service equipment disconnected, we can select Auto Pushback and select our pushback position. Once satisfied, tap Start and let the ground crew handle the rest. Be sure to check out our tutorial to learn more about auto pushback. Once stopped with the tug disconnected, we will begin the engine startup sequence beginning with the number 2 engine. Once stable, start your number 1 engine, then shut down the APU and announce your taxi. The MAX 8 can single engine taxi on the number 2 engine at most weights. With both engines running, we'll begin rolling at idle, though we can apply some breakaway thrust, which should not exceed 35% N1 on the ground. Once moving, remain at or below 10 knots for sharper 90-degree turns. Straightaway taxi speeds should not exceed 25 knots. Yes, even when we're operating a Southwest. As we make our way to runway 35 right, let's brief our departure and chosen takeoff configuration. We'll use flaps 5 for today's departure with a derated thrust setting of 86% N1. Takeoff trim should not exceed 20% for the MAX at medium to lighter weights. You can determine the right setting by taking your load factor, today of 60%, and dividing it by 3. That gives us 20% positive trim for takeoff. The MAX can use a wide variety of takeoff configurations and thrust settings, even including 1 degree of flaps for takeoff. Check out a complete guide for the MAX 8 on our community forum and linked in the description below. As we approach the runway for departure, we'll turn on our landing light and strobe, announce our departure, and taxi onto the runway, coming to a stop as we align with the runway center line. With the brakes held, slowly increase your throttle to 25% or 40% N1. Once stable, release the brakes and increase to our takeoff 1 power setting of 86% N1. Use gentle rudder inputs to hold the runway center line, as the rudder on the MAX is quite sensitive. In heavy crosswind situations, you should use minimal aileron, instead allowing the aircraft to lean into the wind. As we reach our rotation speed of 134 knots, slowly pitch up, careful to not exceed 7 degrees to avoid a tail strike. At heavier weights, it's normal to wheelie for a moment before becoming airborne. Once airborne, we'll go gear up with a positive rate and pitch between 15 and 20 degrees to maintain V2 plus 10 to 20 knots. Passing 1,000 feet above the airport, reduce to a climb power setting of 84% N1, lower the nose, and begin accelerating to 250 knots. As we start a turn on course, we'll look for about 190 knots to go flaps 1 degrees and 210 knots for flaps up. At 10,000 feet, turn off your landing light, seatbelt sign, and again lower the nose and accelerate to a climb speed of 295 knots. This speed will set us up nicely for a Mach speed of 0.79 at cruise, the most common cruise speed for the MAX 8. We'll continue with our climb power setting, pitching for 295 knots, slowly increasing power as we climb higher towards our cruise altitude of 37,000 feet for today's trip. Check out the recommended climb thrust by altitude on the right. Reaching flight level 280, you will transition from indicated to Mach speed. Here you should climb at Mach 0.79 and can expect far less climb performance to cruise, typically at or below 1,500 feet per minute. While at cruise, aim for a power setting between 83 and 88% N1. In especially turbulent conditions, you may elect to slow down below Mach 0.79 for a better ride. The passengers will thank you. We're approaching our top of descent into Ontario. This is a great point to review your star or descent plan, and we're going to use VNAV to the max extent possible. The MAX 8 is a very slippery aircraft with ineffective flight spoilers, so always start down sooner rather than later. To account for this poor deceleration, we'll proactively reduce our speed to 250 knots approaching 10,000 feet to ensure a stable arrival phase. As we pass 10,000 feet in the descent, we'll turn on our landing light, ensure the seatbelt sign is on, and now take a moment to review our approach into Ontario. We've filed the ILS 26 right, which is still the most suitable for the winds, and we'll check the runway tab to ensure we've set nav 1 to the 26 right ILS. Much like our initial descent, we'll proactively begin slowing down to get configured for our final approach to runway 26 right. The MAX during its approach will use a unique flap sequence setting 1, 5, 15, then 30 degrees or 40 degrees if necessary for a short field landing. Lower your gear early if you need additional drag to slow down to your flap speeds. As we wait for flaps 1 extension speed of 220 knots, I'll turn LNAV and VNAV off, change over to NAV1 for the ILS 26 right, and start a base turn for the runway. Reaching 220 knots, we'll go flaps 1 degrees, and lower the gear to continue slowing below 200 knots for 5 degrees of flaps. At 180 knots, set flaps to 15 degrees, ensure your spoilers are armed and auto brake set if necessary. Today we'll use manual braking to get a feel for things. We're now on the localizer for runway 26 right and will slow to an approach speed of 145 knots as the glide slope comes into view. Landing flaps of 30 degrees is set about 15 knots above your landing speed. Once fully configured, it's common to have a pitch of 2.5 to 3 degrees on final. Your trim should not exceed 15%, and at very light weights you may even need negative trim.
50.
Coming over the numbers, we'll wait for the altitude callouts. Reduce power to idle and begin your flare at 30 feet. Flare roughly 5 degrees nose high and patiently let the aircraft settle onto the runway. Don't continue pulling back in the flare. We want to avoid a tail strike here. After touchdown, fly the nose to the ground and apply reverse thrust to begin slowing. Much like takeoff, use gentle rudder inputs and allow the aircraft to lean when a crosswind is present, only applying aileron in extreme winds. Begin to apply manual braking below 80 knots and stow your reverse thrust at 60 knots. For sharp, 90-degree turnoffs, be mindful of your speed not to exceed 10 knots. Once clear of the runway, begin cleaning up the aircraft by stowing your spoilers, retracting flaps, and turn the landing and strobe lights off. If taxiing in on one engine, shut down the number 2 engine 3 minutes after landing and turn on your APU. Make your way to the gate and begin prepping for your next journey. Be sure to head over to our community forum and save the complete Boeing 737 MAX 8 guide, packed full of speeds, power setting, tips, and everything else you'll need to master this plane. Thanks for riding along, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.